In order to set the scene for his work, the very first sentence of the racial contract is white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. And it's a really powerful statement, but what that statement does is it places race at the centre of how we manage our societies and our social relations. And Charles Mills is careful not to say that race is the determining structure, like he acknowledges that it intersects with gender and with capitalism and other types of structures. But he really looks at society through that race lens. And his the racial contract falls into sort of that critical race theory paradigm as well. So it's part of that sort of field that assumes that race and racism is normal. It's normal, and our societies revolve around it. His racial contract really cleverly picks apart a whole lot of kind of assumptions around the rules that govern our society, and he starts with social contract theorists like Kant and Rousseau, and he sort of looks at the context of the time that they lived in, and he said, well, actually, these guys were pretty racist. If you looked at their lives and, the way they supported slavery, there's a problem there. He looks at the way that countries were colonised, during the 1500s and 1600s, and the reasons that legitimised that colonial invasion. And it was simply that indigenous people and the people who were first in those societies that Europeans moved into were not thought of as real humans. They were subhumans, they were savages, they were in need of enlightenment. There were all these sort of justifications that were used to take over their lands. And it was all due to Europeans, whites being perceived as humans and the indigenous peoples as being perceived as subhumans. Eventually it transpired that overt racism and all those sort of assumptions around biological inferiority became seen as unpopular, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast. And so societies had to construct new ways, new rationales or new logics to sustain that unequal power dynamic but make it seem like racism had disappeared. And this is where we fall into Mill's logic of an epistemology of ignorance. So he says that, these new ways of governing society that made that disguised, I guess, the initial way that people came in and colonised countries had to be overlooked somehow. And so what New Zealand did, if we're looking at our particular context, what we did is we forgot our history. We forgot the difficult parts of our history. We went into a state of historical amnesia, particularly around things like the New Zealand Wars. And we constructed our environment, and if we look at schooling in particular, in a way where we didn't have to look at those histories. We didn't have to teach our own history. And so, for many years, until quite recently, in fact, teaching our national history has been an option for history teachers. And, I certainly went through the school system not learning very little about how Māori were taken over or Māori communities were pushed off their land. And so this sort of falls into our own kind of constructed epistemology of ignorance in relation to schooling, was actually not teaching history. Yeah, so I guess that is, one of the main ways that power dynamic between Pākehā and Māori has been able to be sustained is through sort of active fostering of ignorance of the past. Because by doing that, the whole narrative around New Zealand being a fair and equitable society where everyone, gets a fair go if we work hard enough, that's been able to thrive because there's no sort of counter-narrative that says, hey, we aren't a meritocratic nation. We're actually steeped in all these injustices that have been done to the original inhabitants.
And as we move into this, you've spoken of this idea of a settler contract. I guess at its foundation is all about the past and the present and how we exist in the present and how we think about the past. And the settler contract, this idea of historical amnesia, works to I guess, forget the things that are inconvenient about the past that do not serve this dominant historical white narrative. And in the PhD, you speak about the historical amnesia arises from Pākehā anxieties about the tenuous nature of colonial settlement on indigenous territories. This idea that Pākehā don't want to remember the injustices of the past, and therefore, as you've mentioned previously, we soften the language, we skirt around the difficult topics. As you said, having studied NCA history, I was lucky to be in a school and be put in a history class where the teachers simply chose to focus on the New Zealand wars rather than, I think at the time, this would have been 2011 to 2013, was it focusing on the monarchy in England, which in hindsight just is baffling. And I feel very fortunate to have just had a teacher that chose, for whatever reason, to focus on that. And we went on a trip to explore some of the pā up in the Taranaki area. But yeah, this idea of socially constructed historical amnesia and how we skirt around the things that we don't want to remember to focus on this dominant narrative. And I suppose that then pivots us into this other idea that you explore within your work, this state narrative of biculturalism. Could you speak to that a little bit? I guess this idea that in some ways the state narrative wants to put out this message that there is balance between Māori and Pākehā. You also spoke before about the role of Pacifica and having to define them within separate frameworks, and you said, well, if you're defining them separately, then there is not the implication of not needing to do that.
Yeah, I guess, that's good, because that's how, I guess, institutional racism is activated in a way as well. So in the 80s, biculturalism was formally introduced by the government as a policy to look as though it was equitably including Māori. And this was on the back of a whole lot of Māori activism in the 1970s that really brought to the fore, hey, our institutions are meant to be for everyone, not just for who they were catering for. Then. So biculturalism was this formal policy, Māori and Pākehā existing in a kind of partnership side by side. One of the scholars I draw on in my work, Dominic O'Sullivan, writes a lot about, he wrote a book called Beyond Biculturalism, which really critiqued the nature of this inclusion, and he said that it was quite token and superficial and symbolic. And so what I talk about in my thesis is how biculturalism as this official policy of inclusion supports historical amnesia, because it gives the impression that we are equitably including Māori, whereas we are only including certain aspects of what it means to be Māori. And so in the thesis as well, what I do is I kind of extract key points around what biculturalism actually looks like in schools and in the classrooms. I think one of the points I raised about biculturalism is that it's limited inclusion, which we've spoken about, that biculturalism must feel good. So you can see how the certain things I've talked about already speak to that. And the other aspect of biculturalism that feeds into the state narrative of biculturalism, which is equitable inclusion, is that it freezes indigenous temporalities or persons, I suppose. And by that I mean, if the norm is whiteness in an education system, and then Māori and Pacifica and other ethnic groups are kind of included on the side, then only certain aspects are allowed into that main dominant system. And part of that is actually a particular Māori personhood is understood and taught to, if that makes sense. So Māori, although we might share the same ethnic identity, we are culturally diverse, through assimilation, through regions, rohe, iwi, have different ways of operating. And I guess a state narrative of biculturalism doesn't acknowledge this sort of diversity within Māori society, or it does it in piecemeal ways. Like you talked about having a great history teacher who actually did address difficult histories. Well, there are great teachers out there who would have taught New Zealand history in that way. And like there were teachers who probably, did think more critically about their Māori students' identities. But when you've got policies and when you've got sort of standardised ways of operating that come from a centralised government, telling you what to do, particularly if you're non-Māori, you'll probably end up doing the state narrative of biculturalism unconsciously because, you've got all these other competing interests and things you have to do as a teacher.
Thanks for watching PhD Unpacked. If you enjoyed that little snippet and you want to watch the whole interview and have access to a whole bunch of extra stuff surrounding the PhD Unpacked project, head over to Patreon and become a patron. Patreon.com/PhD Unpacked.